with this. All right. That should be recorded. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, welcome. I would like to introduce all of you guys to our second installment of our Mercy Archives speaker series this afternoon. So for those who do not know me, my name is Shelby Dry. I'm the coordinator here at Mercy Archives, and I have the privilege of introducing our program today. We're very excited to be hosting this series. This series highlights the works and contributions of sisters to their ministries, their works, and their contributions to the community. So for this second installment today, we're pleased to be hosting Sister Paula Diann Marlin. She is the former South Central Community Archivist. She's a Civil War historian as well as a writer. So as our second speaker in this series today, she's going to be discussing her upcoming book, Courage and Compassion, The Sisters of Mercy in the American Civil War. We're going to be discussing real stories from sisters in battle, their experiences with working the front lines, and their testimonies of aiding wounded soldiers. And we're going to dive into the realities of what happened during the Civil War from their perspective. We're also going to take a look at why the Sisters of Mercy took their work to the front lines of the battlefield. We would like to remind everyone this is going to be a recorded session today, so you will be able to go back and watch it later if you so wish so. We hope you enjoy this installment of the Mercy Archives speaker series. And just a housekeeping rule before we get started. Men's restrooms are on this side, ladies are on this side, and we have some refreshments at the back of the room if you would like to partake in those. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Sister Paula Diann and let her take over.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? I'm holding in my hand the last printed copy of this book that's gone through about 3 revisions over several years. And it's at the publisher now, and I'm not quite sure when it will be out, but it should be within, I guess, next month or two. So without further ado, I'll start telling you about it. First of all, my main objective in writing this book was to put together in one book true events about the Sisters of Mercy and their interaction with wounded soldiers and prisoners during the Civil War. The basic stories can be found in community histories and other sources, but most of the books that have these stories were published long ago and probably out of print. And of course, they've largely been forgotten. I've dug through many, many boxes of old records stored here at Mercy Heritage Center, which particularly Betsy and Emily were, very helpful with. And so I've pieced together what I think is a rather inspiring story. And I want to shed light on these stories to show how compassionate caring for strangers, equal treatment of all people, and a willingness to do for others, even at great cost to themselves, is very relevant today. Our world is sorely in need of people who practice such traits. You might wonder, why would educated, cultured, religious women abandon their normal works and courageously head into the unknown, possibly dangerous situations during the greatest upheaval in American history? The simplest answer is that the sisters were motivated by their religious beliefs. That Catherine Macaulay, the foundress of the Sisters of Mercy, passed down to her followers through word and example. They were taught to follow the gospel mandate to love one another and people in unfortunate circumstances by sacrificing themselves for the needs of others. Certainly, the wounded and disease ridden soldiers who were in danger of death, or who had lost limbs, or who were scarred for life, both physically and mentally, needed compassionate women to tend to their needs and to help them cope. I'm going to tell you about a few individual sisters who answered the call to serve in very chaotic and hopeless situations. But no matter where they served, they treated all people equally with respect and kindness, regardless of their religion, race, nationality, or political beliefs. They ignored the bigotry that often surrounded them and counteracted it with patience, humility, and meekness. They frequently confronted the dying in their last hours, comforted the dying in their last hours to ease their way into eternity. Soldiers meeting sisters for the first time, not knowing who they were, thought they were widows searching for dead husbands. You could blame them. They were dressed in black from head to toe. Sisters of Mercy from New York City were asked to serve at a sorry excuse for a hospital in a former hotel in Beaufort, North Carolina. After 7 sisters arrived on a small boat, soaking wet from the storm, they were shown to their rooms whose walls and floors were blood-stained, and there was filthy bedding which smelled horribly. These are the kind of conditions they frequently walked into. Keep in mind that they were used to cleanliness. It always was said that cleanliness and orderliness was close to God. So anyway, when they finally arrived, they had not eaten since breakfast. So they asked if any dinner was available. The cook's best dinner, and I mean best, was served in a room with a wet, greasy floor and a dirty table with utensils which consisted of one knife, one iron spoon, and a jackknife. On the table sat a huge pot of cold, moldy pork and beans and a damp loaf of bread. The tired sisters reacted not with anger, but with laughter. They had never seen such an inedible meal and unusual utensils. Needless to say, they went to bed hungry that night and slept very little. A tour of the wards the next day showed how bad the situation was. The patients suffered from neglect, poor food, little furnishings, a lack of medications, and bloody bandages unchanged since the day they were wounded. Their only nurses had been convalescing soldiers. How the situation was remedied is the long story of the book. However, I will just mention uh, one particular sisters took care of. Sherman was a New Englander who was shot in the face. His mouth and chin were so shattered that two doctors looked at him and they decided not to bother with him because he would die anyway. Can you imagine that? Well, anyway, Sister Mary Augustine and Sister Mary Frances didn't agree with that assessment, so they sprang into action. They sponged the wounds with warm water and they tried to loosen the rags that had been covering his face and head. If you imagine, they didn't, somehow or another, the bandages had gotten lost during the battle, and they could find to stop wounds from bleeding was shirt, rags of shirts, or whatever they could buy. And so they weren't necessarily clean or anything else. But those wounds were still wrapped with those very same things. So when they removed them from his head, pieces of flesh flowed from his mouth. Sister Mary Augustine cleaned out what was left of his shattered mouth to help him breathe. He had loose teeth like floating around in his mouth. They took special care of him until he was restored to health. Though dreadfully disfigured, he was able to go home to his very grateful family. He was very disfigured, but he lived. And I wonder what the doctors thought or felt after that. Chicago Sisters of Mercy were on board a troop ship bound for a hospital in Lexington, Missouri, after a battle that had been fought there. And they got off to a very rocky start. The ship rounded a bend in the Missouri River, and they were caught in a crossfire of Confederate rifles from both sides of the river. Cannonballs damaged the hull and pilot house as bullets whizzed over the sisters' heads. The river pilot reacted quickly, turned around, and headed back to St. Louis. That no one was killed was thought to be miraculous. Since Lexington was out of reach, the sisters were reassigned to a hospital. That hospital, they found patients lying helplessly on the floor, wrapped in blankets due to a lack of beds. The day that the sisters arrived, one of the wardens expressed a dislike for papists and threatened them. Later, that same man was sent on a reconnaissance mission, and he was wounded badly and brought back to the hospital. Sister Mary Alphonsus, whom he had threatened, quietly and charitably tended to his wounds. Touched by her compassionate care, he admitted that he was a rabid Orangeman from Northern Ireland and that he hated Catholics since boyhood. But after experiencing the good care that he received, he told her, and I quote, knowing now that you make no distinction of persons in waiting on soldiers, whatever their creed, I have changed my mind and believe your faith must be the true one. He was baptized soon after and apologized a few hours before his death for all of the hate he had expressed and the trouble he had been. Sisters of Mercy from both Cincinnati and Chicago arrived at Shiloh, also known as Pittsburgh Landing in Tennessee, about a week after a 2-day battle. Now that's important. A week later, a number of hospital ships had already crammed wounded men into every available inch on cots, on the floors, and even on the deck of the ships, and then headed to Midwestern cities. Most of the soldiers fighting there were from Midwestern states. Thousands more of the wounded were still lying in the mud among the dead. Cold, heavy rain was falling, and the men on the field received no medical attention, no water, no food, and they had no blankets to cover themselves in the rain. Several sisters from Cincinnati arrived aboard the hospital steamboat Superior. This confusion reigned as wagons bringing supplies from the ship floundered in the mud. The sisters, while overwhelmed by the smell of gunpowder and the stench of dead, unburied men and horses, began tending to immediate needs of as many of the mutilated men as possible using the supplies at hand. As they went about the battlefield, they found some soldiers missing limbs or had gaping head, chest wounds. Others were just delirious, but they identified the ones that they thought they could help. They cleaned and bandaged the wounds and stopped some of them from bleeding to death. And they comforted some of them that were beyond help, that there was just no way that they would live. When the Superior was loaded with as many men as possible, there were still over 6,000 men waiting in excruciating pain for transportation. The sisters chose to stay, help the men on the battlefield and in the tent field hospitals. When smallpox broke out in several of the tents, their attendants fled. Mother Teresa and her sisters devoted themselves to caring for the men who were crying out in pain. The sisters knew that they were in danger of contracting the disease themselves. They took care of the men anyway. Those sisters courageously served at the Shiloh battlefield for 4.5 months until the last steamer arrived to transport the remaining patients closer to their home states. The sisters left in August of 1862. The battle was early in April. So after spending months doing exhausting work with little sleep, poor diet, and insufficient shelter, they left the battlefield. They would not forget the memories of soldiers saved and soldiers lost for the rest of their lives. One evening, and the accounts are very. You can't really tell exactly dates. They didn't record dates, and I think they really lost track of dates. But apparently, they arrived also within a week of the battle. But as far as I know, the two groups ran into each other. One group was really busy out on the field, and the others, um, it sounds like well, the second group, the Chicago Sisters, they were horror stricken when they saw the men and the dead horses lying on the battlefield. They arrived at night, so by lantern light, they went out on the battlefield and searched for the soldiers who showed signs of life. Stretcher bearers followed along with them, and then they would carry the wounded to the Empress. Um, and after a dismal night and day, they had managed to find 300 injured men, and they crammed them into every inch of space on the ship. And while this makeshift hospital steamed up the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers, the six sisters were occupied from early morning until midnight, dressing wounds, distributing medication, and washing and clothing the men, comforting the distraught. There were insufficient doctors, insufficient supplies, hopeless confusion, and agonized screams as doctors amputated limbs without anything to dull the pain except perhaps a bit of whiskey. The sisters nursed the injured aboard the Empress on 3 trips from Shiloh. The first trip was the longest one to newly established military hospitals in confiscated buildings in Keokuk, Iowa. After 2 days of unloading helpless passengers and another 2 days of cleaning the steamboat, it returned to Shiloh. The second load of passengers were delivered to hospitals in St. Louis, Missouri, where Sisters of Mercy of the city were tending to sick and injured men at large tents at the fairgrounds. The third and last load of suffering men were taken to military hospitals in Louisville, Kentucky. The sisters spent 5 weeks from early April into May of 1862 until they returned to Chicago. After all the incessant work, um, some of them never fully recovered their former health, but their quiet devotion to duty changed the hearts of many soldiers prejudiced against Catholics, and especially sisters. One of the Chicago sisters, Sister Mary Louise Berry, died in Peoria, Illinois in 1902. Her obituary noted that her reward for service was an Army pension of $12 a month for the last 4 years of her life and an Army daughter's headstone cemetery where she was buried. Meanwhile, down in Mississippi, um, the Foundation of Sisters of Mercy in 1860, just 1 year, after their arrival or started. And they were impacted by 1862. Vicksburg was up on a bluff of the Mississippi River. From May through July of 1862, it was shelled intermittently by 7 federal gunboats, which terrified the population. The superior of the Sisters of Mercy was Mother Mary DeSales Brown, who had been trained as a surgical nurse at the Pittsburgh Mercy Hospital. Under her leadership, the school and convent were converted into a makeshift hospital to care for wounded Confederates from the city and the surrounding area. In mid-June, Dr. Ross, who was in charge, asked the sisters to go with him and all of the wounded to a deserted house in Mississippi Springs to get the men away from the sounds of Union guns. The first week, there were 400 wounded men. The second week, there were 700. It soon became clear that the location was too isolated to receive medicine and supplies regularly. So the doctor asked the sisters to travel with the patients to Jackson, Mississippi. Now, transportation was on railroad flat cars or in box cars that had previously transported animals such as cows. So you can imagine the smell. The new location was better organized, and the sisters settled into their cities. A few months later, the sisters were sent to Oxford, Mississippi, where there were over 1,000, and the sisters were assigned to one college building, and the situation there was very chaotic. Inadequate food, equipment, staff, medical supplies, whatever they needed, it wasn't there. In late February of 1863, more wounded men arrived with their caretakers from Corinth, Mississippi, and they were being pursued by General Grant as the Union Army was coming down the river. And these caretakers said that the Union troops were heading toward Oxford. And if there was a panic at this news, it did not prevent the staff from reacting rather quickly. They managed to get all but 60 of the patients that were too fragile to move back in freight cars to move to Jackson. And they left Corinth 2 hours before the Union Army arrived. A few months later, after the sisters were all settled back in Jackson, um, the Battle of Jackson was announced by cannon fire. Everyone at the hospital was terrified when one shell landed in a ward and collapsed the corner of the building. one of the sick men um, was so terrified of the roar of cannon that he fled, never to be seen again. General Sherman's men easily overran the opposition, and the victorious army entered the city and began setting fire to buildings involved in the war effort. Of course, the fire was not really controllable. One of the casualties was the Catholic Church, where the sisters' chaplain had celebrated Mass with them that morning when they already knew that the Union troops were out on the edges. But that burned down. After the city surrendered, uh, Dr. Brickle, sisters, their caretakers, and the wounded were allowed to leave the destroyed city in railroad boxcars again. And this time they went to Shelby Springs, Alabama, uh, which was a resort hotel, but very bad because it had been a training center. And so that's where they set up a hospital again. And the sisters served there for 2 more years, but it was filled with intense labor, terrible hardships, uh, very little food, and just lingering prejudice. But that is um, kind of it's very unusual in the way they kept moving around from place to place, being pretty much chased by Grant and Sherman in their conquests. Meanwhile, in Savannah, Mother Mary Vincent Mahoney and 5 of her sisters answered the call for nurses at what was called Ford, Georgia Confederate Hospital in Augusta, Georgia. The hospital consisted of 4 churches that had been seized by the Confederate government. Massive numbers of casualties arrived daily from battlegrounds in Tennessee and northwestern Georgia. The patients were packed close together on pews with only a narrow path between rows. One patient, Private Bill Fletcher, a 23-year-old Confederate from Beaumont, Texas, arrived by train with other disabled soldiers. Bill, a Baptist, ended up on a pew he described as an inadequate cot in a Catholic church with Mother Mary Vincent and Sister Mary Ann tending to him. His lower left leg and foot were seriously damaged, and the doctor, fearing gangrene, wanted to amputate. Bill protested, and Mother Mary Vincent asked the doctor to wait a few days to see if frequent cleansing of the wound would ward off gangrene. They really had no idea of germs and the connection of that and infection and the whole business. That just wasn't on the radar. The sisters' vigilant care saved the foot, and Private Fletcher regained his ability to walk. He wrote in his memoirs, and quote, "It was my first experience with the sisters, and I was in love with the women and the uniform, and haven't gotten over it yet. For there is a feeling of gratitude uppermost when and where I behold them. After the war, Private Fletcher became a prominent Texas lumberman. He built and funded the first Catholic hospital in Beaumont, Texas, in gratitude for the compassionate care of the Savannah sisters. And we might mention that um, we have a copy of his memoirs in the vast collection here at the Heritage Center. And Private Fletcher's granddaughter actually visited St. Vincent's because she wanted to see where, she wanted to meet the sisters who had so carefully cared for her grandfather. After the war, there's an often told story in the Pittsburgh community about Wooden Will. Will was named that because he lived wood. He lived under a wood pile. He was a boy. His father died at the Stanton Hospital in Washington, D.C., under the care of Sister Regina, knowing that he would die because of gangrene following amputation. The soldier asked Sister Regina to deliver a message to his wife. He had received a letter from his wife telling him that his newborn son, Willie, had been born with two little fingers on his left hand. After seeing so many deaths because of amputation, the father did not want the extra finger cut off. Sister Regina promised she would find the mother after the war and tell her. But the father died without giving her any clue about how to find him. 12 years later, Sister Regina met a ragged, homeless boy whose mother Mary had died. And how the two met in Pittsburgh and how the poor boy's life changed is a long story that I don't have time to tell. Now, approximately 25% of all amputees in the war died of infection. That's a terrible amount. And actually, disease was the greatest killer. Approximately 390,000 soldiers died from diseases which easily pass from one soldier to another due to crowded living conditions. Contaminated drinking water, poor diet, and a lack of knowledge of germs all contributed to that. Nurses and doctors were not immune to contagious diseases either, especially when they were overworked due to a shortage of staff and large numbers of men requiring attention. And that was really true throughout the entire war. At the Douglas Hospital in Washington, D.C., 4 Baltimore sisters died during the war years, 2 of undetermined causes, and 2 of typhoid. One of the victims was Sister Mary O'Connor, the superintendent of the hospital. That's her in the picture up there, and as far as I know, it's the only photograph of Sisters of Mercy soldiers in the Civil War. I've never found any trace of any others. Anyway, um, she was known for her remarkable executive ability, good judgment, and tender heart for the wounded soldier. She was weakened by work day and night. Um, that I say that because sometimes soldiers would start arriving from a battlefield in the middle of the night, even though the sisters had worked all day long. They were right there until everyone was taken care of. But weakened by work, she caught typhoid from one of the soldiers she was nursing and died in July of 1860. She was so well thought of that a military escort brought her body back to Baltimore, where she was buried with military honors and the honorary title of Major in the United States. Um, I'd like to just give a few concluding thoughts that sort of sum things up. Over 600 Catholic sisters from 12 religious communities were known to have served during this. I personally think this number is way below what it should be because um, sisters in Sisters of Mercy in places like Savannah and Macon, well, excuse me, Columbus, and Arkansas generally aren't even included in accounts. Um, and I think part of that is because, well, a lot of Confederate records were lost in the fires of Richmond, including all their hospital records. So I really think the Sisters of Mercy were undercounted, but there were over 100 they usually count, but I think it's more like 150. Some of the ones in some of the Midwestern cities that were caring for uh, soldiers in their hometowns or prisoners in some cases were not counted either. Now, let's see. Um, there were Sisters of Mercy that were actually involved in the war from 6 of the Union states, and then 4 were from Southern states. Um, Most of those cities, even the ones that were in Southern states, were either foreign born, mostly Irish, or they were from northern states and had recently gone south. Um, Such as I said, the Vicksburg sisters came from Baltimore. They were only there a year when the war started. Um, Sisters came from Providence, Rhode Island, and went to St. Augustine, Florida, 2 years before the war started. But the bishop moved them to Columbus, Georgia, because he thought it was safer because they received threats that the convent was going to be burned down in St. Augustine. So then they ended up in the middle of destruction of Columbus. Um, Now, uh, let's see. There are 4 major outcomes that came from sisters from all the communities and priest chaplains and even ordinary soldier, um, that it helped to lessen the prejudice against Catholics, for one thing. And the Catholic faith became known as compatible with American values, which was really questioned before that. And the 2 big things the sisters from all the communities realized that um, the way nursing had been done in the homes of sick people was just not the best way to do it. And so uh, they started, you know, building emergency hospitals, and it grew. Like before the Civil War, um, there were three Mercy hospitals. Pittsburgh was the first, Chicago was the second, and San Francisco was the third. But um, by, let's see, by I think it was the end of the century, there were 27 Mercy hospitals. And by the time of the um, 1918 flu epidemic, there were 62 Mercy hospitals spread across all 50 states. So a lot of this movement to serve in hospitals started with finding out that the way things were done haphazardly just didn't work. Um, this also um, brought about nursing becoming a respectable uh, profession for women. So those are some of the outcomes, but it's mainly the expansion of hospital in the hospitals and the advancement of nursing. A lot of the Mercy hospitals, as well as for other communities that were founded after the war, started including nursing schools. They actually started training women to be nurses. And if anybody has any questions, I'll try to answer them. No questions. That's right. Yeah. And you know that back in the good old days, we only had two habits. And I mean, I have wondered so much, what did they do when they lived in tents? Um, you know, I just can't imagine it myself. It's like, but I can't find any more information, you know, other than what's in the accounts. And, you know, they really, in the communities that actually kept journals, they had an awful lot of details, but some didn't keep journals. And all that we know about it is really what other people wrote about them. Um, in my epilogue, I have just a long list of things that other, you know, um, politicians, generals, um, oh, church, church leaders said about them after the war. So, but you're right. That just can't imagine. And so you see I mean, the sacrifice. It's I don't know. But they did everything they could. That's all I know. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. That one of the stories I didn't tell here in Arkansas, the sisters came here in 1851, but they had three academies: Little Rock, Fort Smith, and Helena. There was a major battle by all three of the, not far from those academies. One of them, the academy was up on a hill, and the sisters and all the boarding students were up on the hill watching this battle. After the battle, the sisters went down on the battlefield and started trying to take care of soldiers. You know, so it's like they certainly didn't volunteer except on the spur of the moment, you know. So anyway, um, I'm not sure where the book. Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah, and that very situation, it's very clearly stated in the Arkansas account because um, what happened was the sisters in Little Rock were taking care of Confederate soldiers from the battle at Pea Ridge, which was the first major battle in that state. And they were taking care of Confederates, but then the Confederates tried to go back to the Federals again, and they were chased back by the Federals through Little Rock, and then they've got Federal wounded and Confederate wounded all together had fallen as as they were chasing each other, and the sisters took them all in, whoever, and at first. Uh, the soldiers camped not far from the convent, treated the sisters very badly. Like they took their fencing and made firewood out of it. They stole the cows to slaughter for meat. Um, they did other things. But what changed the situation was because the fence was gone, one of the sisters' cow, and they had cows so they'd have milk for the students and all and meat. Anyway, one of the cows got out of the field, and so the sister was trying to find him, and she ran into a Union soldier, and the two started talking. The sister was from Ireland, and she recognized the accent of the soldiers. He was an Irishman from the Sur Valley, I think it was. Anyway, the two started talking, and then his whole regiment was an Irish regiment. So then they protected the sisters and made sure nothing else had happened. So it was kind of, again, those spur of the moment things. They took care of wounded from both sides. Anything else? Well, I thank you. I thank you for coming, and I hope in the next couple of months, the book will be printed. It's it's in process. That's all I can say right now. Oh, Susan, thank you. Mhm.
Well, thank you all again for coming out today. Before you leave, feel free to grab a refreshment at the back, but can we get one more round of applause for Sister Paula Diann? Yes, thank y'all for attending, and this will be available on our social media to go back and rewatch if you guys would like. Thank you.